Hey, Destiny, can you hear me?
Hey, what's up?
How's it going? I got Destiny on one end and Ben Burgis on the other. How's it going, gentlemen?
Yep.
Pretty good.
So yeah, I was gonna let you two speak unless you really want me to like legitimately moderate this. In which case I could.
Well, do you want to at least talk about just in general what we're talking about and like maybe like some like ballpark about how long we're going to talk about it?
Yeah, fuck, I forgot. I need to find the clips. What is it? I don't even remember what we're talking about.
Okay, so originally, I don't know. So originally, like ago, whenever we were talking about
Nathaniel.
talking again, that was going to be about rent control and the Bernie Sanders housing plan. I mean, I'd be up to do that. I'd be up to like revisit a little bit of like the previous conversation or some combination of those. But like, I also, since this is hard to schedule, I do want to like spend a little bit of time here, but I also have to like pack and stuff tonight. So if we kind of had some idea of like what the time frame was, that'd be good for me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much time, so we could chat fairly quickly. What do you want to talk about?
Okay. Do you want to start with the rent control and housing stuff?
Yeah, we can talk about rent control if you want. Sure.
Because that was I don't know how well you remember, but like a week or two ago, you had tweeted at me and asked if I was ready to come on then, and I was like just leaving campus, and I was like, do you want to do it in an hour? And it didn't end up happening, but that one was going to be about that, so we might as well do like at least a minute on that to start.
Okay.
So,
Hit me up.
yeah, you go.
I mean, my position is I think rent control is a horrible policy. I don't think it helps anybody that it's supposed to help. It causes a lot of damage to people that it's supposed to help, and it damages the housing market in general. I just think it's a really dumb policy. It doesn't do anything good.
Okay, so my position is that I think it does actually help a certain group of people. And I think that if the concern, what I usually see as the concern for rent control, people who have your position,
Mhm.
is that it's going to lead to less new housing being built, that's going to be the big unintended consequence. And so, to the extent that that is supposed to be the big unintended consequence, I would say that since in the Bernie Sanders housing plan, it's paired with massive investment in public housing. I think that addresses that sort of main concern.
Whoever
And I
made the
think the way that
Halloween
the sort of
emotes, I
conversations
love
played
you.
out in the past has been like, okay, well, if that's the case, then why not just do the public housing part and skip the rent control? But I think that the two policies address separate needs. So I think rent control helps people who are already housed.
Why would you want
You
to
know,
help people that are already housed?
because lots of those people need help because they have because even in major cities that are very expensive, there are lots of working class people who are already housed and they need help because lots of those people face eviction and other problems because the rent keeps going up. And so I think that's a population worth helping, and I think
Sure.
that they have
So
a.
let's sure. So let's look at two different parts of this. There's two different ways you
Sure.
can do this. So one is philosophical, and then one is going to be empirical. So when we ask about like who it helps, you saying the people that are already there. What about all the people that
Yeah.
don't need that help, like the middle class people and the upper class people? And what about the people that start to overconsume housing because they've gotten rent control now? Like, how is this good?
Okay. So the thing about the middle class and the upper class people is a general objection to social democratic policies of just about any kind: universal health care, universal college education. I remember this was a Hillary Clinton talking point in 2016. I don't want to pay for Trump's kids to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'd say about that is that universal programs tend to be just strategically better than means tested ones. They're more politically viable. They're less vulnerable to future budget cuts because they have bigger constituencies. They just sell themselves better. That this is something that's a universal social right. Whereas, so like I think just a really nice quick illustration of this is if you look at the difference between like Obamacare, which the Republicans could spend years symbolically voting to repeal, and they could still win elections after that, versus universal programs in Canada and the UK, which even the conservative parties in those countries have to pretend to support because they're so popular. I think, or for that matter, even in this country, Medicare for seniors. Nobody comes out and says we want to abolish that because the constituency is too big and too unified to do that. So I'm comfortable with that, right? The fact that it helps people who don't need help, I think, is more than worth the political benefits of it. And again, when it comes to people who would benefit from new housing, I think that you can fill that in with massive investment in public housing, a la what you see in Vienna, what you see in Austria, elsewhere in Austria, what you see in Singapore, what you see in Sweden, where that's all been very successful.
So I'm not familiar with a lot of these other places. I know that in Sweden it has not been considered necessarily successful. So for instance, the waiting list to get on to an apartment in places like Stockholm is literally like 20 to 30 years. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about housing. I was just in Sweden for a month and I got to talk to a couple people about it. I didn't realize like how difficult it was to actually find housing there, because people always cite it as like such a great example of like housing development. It seems like Sweden actually does have a lot of problems supplying houses to people because of the way that their waiting lists and guarantees and everything work. I find this pragmatism argument to be very unconvincing. I know that a lot of people say it. Well, universal programs don't get cut as much. I've tried to search for this. I really have, because I'm all for like pragmatic politics. I say it all the time. It's why I favor multi-payer over single payer, even though single payer might be better, because I think multi-payer is more pragmatically possible. But I've never found evidence of this ever. The idea that like a universal program is harder to cut than a program that like isn't universal, I don't know if that's true. I do know that a lot of programs die because people can't find funding for it. And the more universal the program is, you need to bring in way more money to fund it. And this leads to a lot of problems. Universal programs lead to a lot of problems that lead to like overconsumption as well, which causes the programs to not work as well. So for instance, in the United Kingdom, overconsumption of education was a problem, where too many people were going to school and the quality of the education fell. And there were a lot of problems related to like, mainly it was middle class people that were just going to school because they had the opportunity to, and now it was free, and the quality fell for everybody. Or in the United States, rent controlled areas lead to a lot of overconsumption of housing. So for instance, maybe you have a house, maybe you have a few kids, those kids move out, you're sitting in a 3-bedroom apartment, you're the only person there, but it's rent controlled. So instead of moving like you normally would, you just sit there and occupy it forever because it's rent controlled. Why would you leave? It's a really good deal. So yeah, I find the pragmatic argument very unconvincing. I know Sweden is a really bad example of successfully done like public housing. I know they have a lot of housing problems. I don't know.
So I would need a lot more to think that Sweden was an unconvincing example. So the fact that there's a waiting list, I think, is extraordinarily weak evidence, for the same reason that the existence of long wait times for universal healthcare, I find extraordinarily weak objection to that. So I think what you need to look at, the same way that for universal healthcare, you don't want to just look at wait times. You want to look at life expectancy. You want to look at infant mortality. You want to look at mortality amenable to healthcare. And if those things were all better, but people have to wait longer, then I'd say that is morally and in every other way vastly superior to a system that serves people less well, but where rich people can buy their way to the head of the line. Similarly, in terms of Sweden versus countries without that level of investment in public housing, I would say that the thing to look at is, okay, sure, does it take you a long time to get into this building because you can't just buy your way in, based on having more money? Okay, that's one consideration, but another consideration is, what's the homelessness rate? What's the eviction rate? That if those things are really low, then that seems like well worth the trade-off. As far as the political pragmatism argument, I think that the examples I gave you do strike me as pretty persuasive. Now, you could say those are a few countries that we're comparing.
So like, I would have to like, real quick, and I don't know all these numbers offhand, but I'm just like on a quick Google. The homeless rate in the United States is 0.17%. The homeless rate in Sweden is 0.36%. There's 553,000 homeless in the U.S., 34,000 homeless in Sweden. So as a percentage of population, I don't know what numbers we would have to look at to find out if Sweden's like housing situation is like good. I do know that kids are staying in Swedish homes longer and longer and longer because they aren't able to get houses. They either don't have the capital to buy into a co-op, which is what a lot of the housing structures are, or they don't want to sit on a wait list for literally 20 to 30 years, which is not acceptable. That's not working. That program's not working. It doesn't seem like their homeless rates are like any better than in the U.S. either. Now I'm sure they have a lot of other social programs that make their homeless better off than in the US, like their healthcare and everything is probably better. But yeah, I don't know. I just like in this particular scenario, I just don't find these arguments like convincing at all. It seems like a horrible Band-Aid program for what really needs to happen, which is more houses need to be built.
Yeah, more houses need to be built, but there's absolutely no reason it has to be private sector rather than the public sector. That seems like the heart of it.
Well, the
We could
reason is
also-
because we have a capitalist economy, not a planned economy, right? I mean, we could build public housing if we want. I mean, that's
but
Mhm.
there are places that aren't complete, that are by no means even close to being completely planned economies, that have massive investment in public housing. In fact, and some of those are because of longstanding intervention by social democratic parties, like the Swedish example or like the Viennese example. But some of those are just like, otherwise technocratic neoliberal kinds of hellholes like Swiss, like Singapore, where it's they have in see. So I'm sorry, I was trying to look up real quick about the stats, but that seems to be a case, right? Singapore is not a completely planned economy, to put it mildly. It always goes way up on the rankings for economic freedom, from like libertarian institutes that rank different countries in the world by economic freedom. They always rank Singapore really highly, and
Okay.
that's a place where 80% of the population lives in publicly owned housing. I've been to Singapore. A lot of that publicly owned housing is very nice. And I certainly don't think, if you can find, all right, so I guess I can't find the actual percentage of homeless people in Singapore.
Well, why not? I'm
on
just
a-
curious. Why not just zone more houses and let people come in and build more houses, and then let people like rent and buy there? Like prices will fall.
Okay.
The supply of houses increases.
One, because it's because if you're actually like facing eviction in the short term, then like any kind of policy where you say, we're going to let the market do its thing and wait for the benefits to trickle down to anybody else, then like there's certainly no guarantee that like those alleged benefits are going to kick in.
Okay, so
in time to.
I really don't like the phrasing here. This idea that you just snuck in the word trickle down. Like this is a pretty basic thing. If you build more houses,
Well, actually, no. I mean that is literally accurate, right? Like,
okay,
we're
well, but
talking
the
about-
problem is in your policy, like the nice thing about you suggesting rent control is that when you suggest rent control, it feels good because the people that you help are immediately noticeable. All those people that live in a rent controlled area, they get to enjoy lower rents. You see that benefit immediately. But what you don't see in your policy is all of the poor and middle class people that can't afford to live there now because houses aren't being built and because the rents
Destiny,
and
you're not paying attention. This is a straw man. This is totally inapplicable to the combination of policies being considered, which is a combination of rent control and massive.
Notice the
investment
problem
in
is that.
publicly owned housing.
But I don't disagree with. Well, I don't know how I feel about publicly controlled housing, but like I don't disagree about building more housing. I just don't know why you're so obsessed with pairing it with a loser program like rent control that nobody thinks is good.
Because, well, okay, first of all, lots of people think it's
Nobody,
good.
it's like one of the few things.
Lots of people think it's good. That's a ridiculous straw man. But secondly, the thing that makes you say it's a loser program, the thing that's supposed to be loserish about it, is because it leads to less incentive for the building of new private housing. But if you're also making a massive investment, and there's no economic law that says that you can't do this, this is purely a political decision. If you're also simultaneously making a massive investment in publicly owned housing, then the thing that makes it loserish is not relevant to that conversation. It's
Sure.
only relevant if you're talking about rent control a la carte. If you're talking about rent control plus massive investment in public housing, the fact that there'll be less private housing has been neutralized. That's not relevant to that conversation.
Yeah, so I link the Serfs. I don't care if you show screen or not, but like rent control is like one of these few issues that economists broadly agree is a garbage policy. It doesn't help who we want it to help. It usually hurts who we want to help, and it just doesn't usually get what you want done. Now, I don't understand. I don't know if it's like a hatred for capitalists or a hatred for landowners. If you want more houses,
it's actually what it is it's an understanding of basic logic, because what the economists are talking about is rent control a la carte. That they're saying that if we're just concerned with rent control on its own, then this is bad, because they say, and by the way, there's not nearly as much consensus as you say, but whatever, let's pretend there is. Because if we just have rent control, there's going to be far less investment in private housing. There's going to be far less private housing built. But if you're building a lot of public housing to make up the shortfall, then it's literally you could accept your premise. You could accept what the economists are saying and still think that it's just irrelevant to that package of policies.
Why not just build more houses? Why do you have to couple
Yes,
it with
that is
rent control?
literally what I'm saying.
No, you're not. You're saying,
houses.
sure, rent control is shit, but maybe if
No,
we do
I'm not
building more
saying
houses on
rent
top of
control is shit.
why not just build more houses and let rents fall that way? Like,
Okay, so because the people being saved from eviction are being saved immediately tomorrow by rent control, and the thing that you say makes it a shit policy, the thing you say makes it a loser policy, is having less incentive for building private housing. But that disincentive is irrelevant if you're building more public housing. It's like literally if you're saying that if we build a new road that goes from from this area to this area, that's going to be a loser policy because there's like a certain intersection where there'll be more accidents. You say, okay, well, let's build a road, but also put a stoplight there. And you can argue that the stoplight won't be good enough. That's a separate argument. But just continuing to go on about how if you have the road there, that's going to lead to this bad consequence, as if the proposal weren't to build the road and also build the stoplight, is ridiculous. There's nothing.
Yeah, but the problem is the road and the stoplight accomplish totally different issues. Like building more houses accomplishes a lot of what rent control wants to do, which is limit the cost of housing or make housing more affordable. If you build more properties, you can make housing more affordable because increasing the supply of houses will cause the cost of all the other surrounding properties. This is why homeowners hate zoning more houses. Like.
So you objected earlier to the phrase trickle down, but it's worth underlining and kind of circling a couple times why that's strictly literally accurate here. Because if what you're talking about very often is, oh, we should like free things up, right, with zoning so people can build more. Oftentimes the first case, what they have the most incentive to build immediately. This is why it doesn't really help the people who are going to be evicted next week or next month. What they have an incentive to build immediately are high income housing that these people can't afford. But
you can zone for low income, high density housing. This can all be taken care of with zoning. What, do you not understand how zoning works? Like you can do this.
Well, except that this has been empirically tested so many times, and it doesn't have any of these effects. There's no. Where is the place where you have had some market oriented policy that they have has stopped like eviction from being a big problem because you have these trickle down effects. I mean, look, if you have.
So this has actually happened in areas where in Chicago, rent control was lifted in areas and more housing did appear. And even in some areas, crime fell and there was more affordable housing available as a result of this. There have been places where rent control has been lifted and it has had a positive impact on the affordability of housing in areas. Yes, even empirically, this is borne out. Rent control, if you want to talk about like some people might get evicted now, well, let's talk about like housing vouchers, right? Let's say like, hey, if you're below a certain income, maybe you get some type of either tax credit or some voucher that lets you afford where you want to live. But there's no reason to limit the rents.
Yeah, first of all, the vouchers are not going to keep up, and the vouchers are always going to have what you're talking about, a means tested program. And by the way, let's not let this go from earlier. There is plenty of obvious evidence that means testing is a political loser. The U.S., Canada, UK healthcare example is one great example of that.
How is that a great example?
For the extremely obvious reason that conservatives in Canada and the UK, it's not because of there's something different in the drinking water that makes them have different ideological predispositions.
Wait, what are we talking about right now? I'm totally lost.
Because conservatives in Canada and the UK, like I said earlier, have to at least pretend to support the continued existence of their universal programs, universal health insurance in the Canadian case, the NHS. In the British case, that they have to say, oh well, we want to reform it in certain ways, but they can't say we want to get rid of it. Conservatives in the U.S. can say we want to get rid of Obamacare and continue to win elections. that seems like a really powerful piece of evidence, even within the same country.
That's one piece of evidence. I can point to one of the most successful programs that exists in the United States for helping impoverished people to get money is the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's means tested. Like, I mean, like, we can point to like individual programs, but like I'm wholly unconvinced.
But you're saying it's successful in the sense that that like the policy once in place works, but that's just an equivocation. The question is it does it have this kind of political strength, this relative resistance to budget to cuts that universal social programs have? And I think to find that out, we'd have to see, right? We'd have to look at whether there's been some big attempt to take it back, whether how that went. Is there can we compare it to other things that are non-means tested? And
yeah, I would if you ever find that and want to own me on a Twitter thread, go ahead and tweet it at me. I've looked for it, but I have never found this evidence. It's like a really common talking point. This idea that, like,
I just gave you
gave me one program. You gave me one program.
So actually,
I can give you another. In the United Kingdom, their education system was completely universal, and now it's not anymore. And it's doing better as a result. Like, that's a program that was universal. Like, we can go back and forth on single programs. I have not been able to find evidence to support your point.
But you're conflating two completely separate issues.
What do you mean?
Yes, because the argument that we're talking about the political argument is about resistance to budget cuts, how much of a constituency there's going to be for people pushing back against the repeal of something. And that's what you keep trying to say is, oh, here's a means tested program that's been very successful in the sense that it brings about its desired result. Those are two different conversations. Whether it has, whether something, is a successful policy and whether something is a politically durable policy in the long term are just different questions.
Sure, I don't disagree with that, but you haven't given me like strong evidence that universal programs are like politically advantageous over non-universal ones.
Okay, well, I actually did give you evidence, and you just dismissed it without really giving me a reason.
Sure, so you're a philosophy professor, right? Certainly you understand how illogical it is for you to give me two examples and say, one, that the fact that they're universal is causally related to the fact that they are still in existence, and two, the fact that giving me two examples when I can provide you with counterexamples doesn't prove your point. You should know this.
First of all,
you should know this.
You haven't even. First of all, Destiny. Yes, I am a philosophy professor.
Then you should know this.
I know about something called inference to the best explanation.
Okay.
Which apparently you haven't heard of, but they have inference to the best explanation means that when you've got a phenomenon, right? You say, what is the simplest, most obvious, most reasonable explanation of it. And in this case, I've given you you haven't given me an alternate explanation. You're also saying, I'm sorry, but you're also saying, oh, this doesn't count, right? You've given me like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 examples, which I just gave you.
Sure.
But like, I could give you so many more examples, but you haven't actually given me a single example on this point.
Wait, what do you mean on this point?
On the point of the comparative political durability.
I just gave you one. I said that in the United Kingdom, their education was universally free, and now it is no longer. That was a universal program.
So that might be half of an example. What's the other half of the example? So, in other words, if you're going to say it's not true that comparatively speaking, that's the claim. Nobody's saying that it's totally impossible politically. It's that it's like logically impossible to repeal a means tested program. But to give me a complete example, you would have to give me comparison points on both ends. What's the means tested, the non-means tested program that shows that actually non-universality doesn't give any kind of advantage?
I just gave you an example. I don't know.
No, you didn't. You gave me half of an example. You didn't give me a full example. So to give me a full example, you'd have to say, hey, here was this universal program in the UK.
Okay.
Here was this comparable non-universal program somewhere else that turned out to be more politically durable.
Okay, so so I've pointed out that in the UK, their education system changed dramatically from universal to non. In the United States, we have non-universal education stuff that is still non-universal. What is the other half you want?
So hold on. What's the what's the thing that we have in the United States?
We have like, for instance, like we've got like grants and loans and stuff that are available at subsidized rates, like Stafford loans and shit.
Okay, so they have but those have been those have been cut lots of times. Those are those have no particular, like, those are things that have waxed and waned plenty.
Wait, is that actually true? My understanding was that funding for education and those loans have increased and increased and increased. And the affordability of college is still, like, with loans, is still more or less on par. I could be wrong on that, but that's what I'm familiar with. So you're telling me right now that if I go and look up, like, Stafford loan availability or subsidization of education, that has decreased in the United States?
Overall subsidization of education, I believe, has decreased. I'm open to being proven wrong on that, but my understanding was that overall aid from all levels of government to education has decreased overall as a percentage of funding over the course of the last few decades.
Sure. Can I would love, I've got a guy that's looking that up for me. You understand right now that your inference to the best explanation, you're using this in an atrocious way, right? Do you understand that?
No, I actually don't, but please try to explain it to me.
Sure. So inference to the best explanation isn't going to be used to provide a causal link between two highly complicated events. So for instance, if I were to say...
Actually, that's pretty much exclusively what it's used for, but keep going.
Okay. So why don't you explain it to me then? I'm curious.
Inference to the best explanation.
Yep, explain it to me.
I'm actually trying to, but you're interrupting me.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Okay, awesome. So inference to the best explanation, or abductive reasoning, is where you say you've got a phenomenon, and the data is compatible with several different explanations, which of course is always going to be the case. But you say that the one that explains the phenomenon the most, and pretty much any kind of, the sort of home territory of IBE, is scientific explanation, where you're always going to be talking about causal links between complex processes. Otherwise, I don't know, that's pretty much a fairly good one sentence description of the kinds of things we need scientific theories for. And
so you think when we look at the failure or success of some of these programs, you think that the best inference is just whether or not they were universal? You don't think these policies are far more complicated or have way more things weighing into their successes or failures? It's literally just whether or not they're universal or not?
Do you see how what you just said has absolutely nothing in common with what I've said? Do you see that?
You're trying to you're making this appeal. You're trying. No, I'm not caricatured. You're literally
don't yell over each other. Otherwise,
you're literally telling me that, like, you're making an inference to the best explanation that the reason why these programs succeed or fail is literally on whether or not they're universal or not. I don't think that has been demonstrated at all.
Okay, first of all, you've caricatured beyond recognition what the claim was. What the claim was that being universal provides an advantage in terms of political durability over means testing.
Sure, and my counter-argument is that hasn't been demonstrated.
Okay, well, I gave you some examples.
That's not demonstrating it.
That sure looks like the simplest, most plausible explanation.
Really?
Yes, you've that.
Well, let's go over one example then. Go, give me one example.
Okay. One example.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that it's so much easier politically for Republicans in the United States to oppose Obamacare than it is for conservatives in Canada to oppose their Medicare for All system?
Maybe they can't find the funding for it.
That's why that the Republicans in the United States can't find the funding for Obamacare. That's the problem.
Sure.
Do you believe that?
Yeah, it's an expensive program to fund, so sure. Or maybe they don't want that. You don't have to tell me what I believe or not. The onus is on you to prove this. You're the one telling me that you're making the best inference. You're not. What I'm telling you is that these instances are very complicated. So, for instance, if we move to like a form of like single payer,
the fact that it's very complicated doesn't mean that it's not the best inference. Of course, it's very complicated.
No, it's not. It's that anybody that would honestly.
What do you think is the better inference? Because
I think that there's a multitude of.
That's something that you obviously, given your overall political beliefs, right, given your general ideological stature, I do not for a second believe that you believe. So they have that. You really think that the reason the Republicans are opposed to Obamacare is that they can't find money in the budget to fund it?
It's possible but that's one of a multitude of reasons. It could be that people are worried.
It's possible, but do you believe that is actually what's going on?
I wouldn't be brave enough to tell you why a particular policy succeeds or fails without first doing my homework on it, and I sure as fuck wouldn't pin it on a single issue, like whether or not it's universal or not.
Okay. The question is, why has it, is it an advantage in terms of politically succeeding? Right? In other words, of being something that it's hard to overturn or cut. is it an advantage that it's universal? And if you think no, then so you think that, your position, to be clear, right? Like, maybe I'm misunderstanding you as badly as you're apparently misunderstanding me, but like, is your position really that, that it's plausible, not just possible, because of course it's possible, but plausible that the main reason that Republicans are opposed to Obamacare is they can't find money in the budget to fund it?
In a roundabout way, sure. If that money has to be found through taxation or increases in taxes, historically the Republican Party stands against stuff like that. That's why the Trump administration cut record amounts of taxes for wealthy people. Yeah, sure. I think it's
okay, but wait a second.
Yep.
They have a so then something like the Medicare, the Medicare system they have in Canada, you expect conservatives to oppose for the same reason. That's also funded by taxation.
I don't know. It could be opposed by any number of reasons, or not opposed by any number of reasons. I'm not sure. I think it's more complicated than whether or not it's just universal or not. This is like the most naive view of policy I've ever heard in my entire life, especially for healthcare.
So that they have that's something that seems like it would give a program a pretty obvious advantage in terms of standing up to future budget cutters is in fact a factor in its favor. You think that's just like naive and ridiculous and simplistic.
Well, in the case of Canada, maybe the future budget cuts don't threaten it, but in the case of the United Kingdom, future budget cuts had threatened the education. So, I mean, I'm sure it depends from policy to policy, and it probably depends on where you get your money from for the policy. And it probably depends on a multitude of other political issues as well. Also, there might be programs that could go into effect that would be good universally, but they'll never even make it because they can't be funded universally, like what we're dealing with our education. So maybe the things that are universally funded, that are resistant to budget cuts, we might already be past the main problem. Maybe the reason they're resistant to budget cuts is because you had the money for that universal thing, so that's the only reason you could do it. So it has nothing to do with the fact that it's universal now. It's just that you had enough money to do it originally, and that's why it's succeeding. The universal thing is just an after effect.
So it's not any kind of advantage at all that they have that it's something that everybody knows they're going to draw from. Everybody knows that it'll benefit them. That they have that there's no reason at all that would give it any kind of political advantage.
It could be or it couldn't be. Why aren't Americans like universally in favor of things like raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour? Like, why do people fall on party lines for stuff like this? I mean, I think voting is a little bit more complicated than people just saying universally we agree with it or not.
Well, one clear difference between the two cases is that lots of people who are opposed to that don't actually think that they'll personally benefit from it because they currently make much more than minimum wage. That they have that they don't think that they're going to ever be reduced to being on minimum wage jobs. Just like with means tested programs, people don't generally, lots of people, even if it's not true, even if they could very well benefit from in the future, lots of people don't believe that they will ever be in a position where they're going to have to draw on means-tested welfare programs. They think that that's for somebody else, somebody who's not like them, somebody who's probably lazy anyway.
This could apply to healthcare just as easily. How many times do we see attack ads saying like, oh, death panels are going to take away your Obamacare from you, or we're going to ration healthcare and there's going to be long waiting lines. Like, the same thing could be used towards any policy that people don't understand it fully.
Except that if you know that you're going to benefit from something, not that you can't, not that lots of people don't, but there are going to be fewer people who buy into this line of attack because they know they'll benefit from it, right? I mean, that's why Medicare and Social Security, are wildly popular because everybody knows that they personally will benefit from it. And right, think about the old thing about the person at the Tea Party rally waving around the sign saying like, "Get your government hands off my Medicare," right? That's.
Then why don't we already have universal health care? Why didn't all of America get behind the ACA or the public option? Why didn't that happen already? If everybody knew they were going to benefit from it.
Well, because first of all, public option, you're already talking about very different, from a universal program. It was always very unclear who was going to be eligible for the public option. Even if you were hyper focused on everything Obama was saying about that, you were watching all of the healthcare town halls, it was still extremely unclear who was going to be eligible for that public option. So I think again, this idea that this is something that's really going to benefit other people, not you, is going to be much more plausible to people in the case of something that's one element out of a patchwork of some sort of incredibly complicated healthcare bill that they know that they don't understand, which is why the polling on the ACA was already ambiguous, and now even before we have it, Medicare for all already, even a shocking number of Republicans in polls say that we have that. And I think that if history is anything to go by, it's not that it's impossible, right? The stupid straw man, not that like nothing could possibly, there could never be a point politically where the other side is powerful enough to overturn such a program, but it's much harder to overturn universal programs that everybody knows that they personally will be able to draw from and benefit from.
So
I'd also point out that when it comes to the UK and education, that they have that my understanding, right? I'm certainly wouldn't claim to be an expert on the British educational system, but my understanding is that there's much more tracking in the British educational system than there is in the United States. That I don't know if there's anything that's quite equivalent in the UK to, for example, community colleges. So like what your A levels and O stuff are might as a high school student, might have much more of an effect there on whether you're in a position to go to university or not. So I could also see it be the case that lots of British people wouldn't think that free university was something they were going to benefit from, whereas everybody knows that that no matter how healthy you are, right? Everybody knows that they need healthcare or are going to need healthcare.
That's totally not true. There's a lot of healthy people that don't consume healthcare and don't buy into it. This is literally the reason why the mandate exists.
Yes. There are lots of healthy people who don't buy healthcare, but that's very different from saying that they think that they're never going to in their lives need it.
But I don't think people make decisions where they're thinking like, I'm going to support universal healthcare right now because 40 years into the future I'll need it. I don't think any human makes a decision like that. That requires like such an elevated, like hyper mature thought process. It's totally unrealistic.
Okay, but down to earth, more realistically, lots of people think, I might need that. They have that I might get into an accident. They have probably at some point I'll need it. They have there's the whole the fact that people in economically precarious situations, people for whom buying private health insurance would be a significant fraction of their income.
Then why did the ACA?
And if they're making
you got to let them answer.
This is a really nice story, but none of this lines up with what happens in reality. Like as a narrative, like if I was reading this in a book, I'd be like, wow, this makes sense. But the reality is, we needed a mandate for the ACA. Young people don't buy healthcare. Healthy people don't buy healthcare. They dramatically underinvest in it. One of the most important business tips you get in your life when you start making money is, dude, not everybody does it. Invest in your healthcare. Control your downsides. Okay, people don't do this naturally. If everybody supported healthcare because they knew they were going to consume it at some point in time, then guess what? We wouldn't be having these debates about healthcare right now. We would already have universal healthcare. Like everything in the empirical record completely and totally disagrees with the narrative that you're giving me. Like it's a nice story, but it doesn't seem to be true at all. Otherwise, we wouldn't be debating healthcare right now. We'd already have universal healthcare.
I want to be as clear as possible that everything you just said is false. Every single goddamn part of it.
Which part is false?
So the first.
Also, real quick, here's a link in chat.
No. I get to answer now, Destiny.
Okay. What you said earlier about not investing in education was empirically incorrect. I linked it to the Serfs, so he can link that. Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the percentage of higher education that's made up by all levels of government has either stayed steady or risen over the course of the last few decades. That's what you just looked up?
Yep.
Okay, well, I'd love to see that. So in any case, they have so the first thing to notice is that you're equating two things that we all know come apart all the time. One of those is whether somebody is going to personally roll the dice on buying health insurance for themselves that year, right? It's a year-by-year decision. And the other is whether they would support universal health care provided socially as a right. And as I think we both know, I'd be very surprised if you challenge this premise. In fact, the younger people are, both the less likely they are to personally buy health insurance because they're more willing to roll the dice. I don't think I'm going to need it this year. And the more likely they are to support universal national health insurance.
What is the question? What are you asking me if there's like a relation between young people buying healthcare and supporting national healthcare? What is the question exactly?
So they have you were bringing up the ACA needing a mandate as if this were relevant in any way, shape, or form to whether you get more political support for universal healthcare than means-tested healthcare because everybody knows that it'll benefit them. So if there's a link between those, what is it?
You're asking me if you'll get more support for means-tested
healthcare? No, I'm asking you why you're bringing up the ACA mandate, because it sure seemed like what you were saying was the fact that the ACA needed a mandate, the fact that lots of young, healthy people are willing to roll the dice on not buying health insurance this year because they probably won't need it this year. You seem to be bringing that up as if it somehow undermined the claim that universal healthcare programs are more politically durable once they get going because everybody can see that it benefits them. And I'm saying I don't see what the link is supposed to be here, especially because it's pretty obvious that you're going to get that the people who are the most likely to not buy health insurance personally are actually also the same demographic who are the most likely to support national health insurance.
Okay, can I appeal to the Serfs here? Can you summarize this into a question? I'm fucking lost.
Well, I mean, I have to let Ben pose some questions, right?
Can you explain the question to me? I'm lost.
Okay. Destiny.
Yeah.
Why did you bring up the ACA mandate? Tell me one
I
more time.
I brought up the ACA mandate. Yeah, I brought up the ACA mandate because you seem to say that people will always support like a universal program or something like healthcare is going to be universally supported by people, and that seems strange to me because if it's universally supported by people because it's universal, we would have had some form of universal healthcare already, but we don't seem to have that. That doesn't seem to be the case. So I don't understand.
So what does the ACA mandate have to do with that? Because that just seems totally irrelevant to what you just said.
The ACA mandate mandated people that are young and healthy to buy health insurance because they wouldn't otherwise normally do it. Whereas it seems like you're claiming that everybody knows they need an investment in healthcare at some point or whatever, or that people see the importance of a universal program, so they will make that investment.
Yes. And how are those two things linked? Because nothing you've said comes close to linking them.
So if you tell me that every person is in favor of universal healthcare.
Okay. Wild, ridiculous straw man, and you know it, but keep going.
Okay, if you tell me that the majority of people have always been in favor of universal healthcare because they see the importance of that investment, then my question would be, well, why aren't people investing in it already? It seems like that's not the case.
Okay, and I'm saying that there's a giant equivocation in that argument. So there's seeing the importance of it and supporting it in the sense of saying, I would support national health insurance as a policy because I think that would likely benefit me at some, even if I think that if I'm healthy right now, I think that this is likely to personally benefit me and other people that I care about. That's one sense of investing in it. Another sense of investing in it is when you're faced with those tough financial calculations, which are going to be very different, by the way, for the financial calculations involved in taxpayer-funded healthcare. I'm willing to say, I'm going to buy private health insurance instead of rolling dice for the risky bet that I'm not going to need it this year. And those two things just seem completely different to me.
So if people are willing to make this sacrifice or aren't willing to make it on a personal level, why would people be in favor of, say, like a tax increase or whatever in order to do it? You don't think people might see some risk there, even if they are told that their healthcare coverage will ultimately like save them money? You don't think people would have like the same calculation problem? Well,
first of all, it's not the same calculation because national healthcare saves the vast versus private health insurance.
Sure, but not everybody believes that. I know that, but not everybody believes that.
Okay, well, so 2 points there. First of all, the fact that not everybody believes that is relevant to why the argument isn't that this is something. I mean, as a matter of fact, national does have majority right now in the United States.
Wait, national what does?
national health insurance, Medicare for all.
Barely. It's at like 52%, I think. And that could swing either way.
Okay, but they have but the argument is not that because people know that they'll benefit from it, you're going to get support in advance. The argument was always about durability, how long something is going to last after it's been legislated. And there are lots of people who would oppose something in advance, but are more likely, but are going to support come around afterwards because they can actually see from their own case that it benefits them.
Okay,
So
I understand. Okay, I think I understand your argument. Okay, this is my argument. Okay, have you ever heard an argument from I don't know if you're atheist or theist or not. Have you ever heard an argument from a theist that the Earth exists in a perfect manner that supports human life and therefore it's the existence of a designed universe?
Yes.
Okay. So
cosmological fine-tuning.
Yes,
right?
yes. So the problem with the fine-tuning argument is you assume that the universe could only be one way. The reality is that we exist because all of the hard work happened first. Like we're just the product of like what exists of the universe now. Like life theoretically could have been any other number of ways. We just can't conceive of it. This is what I'm appealing to here. Is that you're telling me that universal programs are harder to get rid of than non-universal ones. But what I'm saying is if it's a universal program, it probably just had so much more support before it became universal, and that's the reason why it's harder to oppose. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I think I understand. It makes sense in the sense that I understand why you're saying I don't.
What?
I mean, I understand what you're saying.
So
I don't see any reason. I don't see any reason to think that it's true.
Of course not. But my hypothesis is just as valid as yours, unless we start to appeal to like empirical evidence, which isn't just one or two examples.
Well, this is why you were very quick to dismiss this earlier. But this is why I brought up inference to the best explanation. There are always going to be lots of hypotheses that are logically consistent with the data. The question is what's simplest, what's most explanatory.
First of all, simplest doesn't even work here. That's not fair. You can't just go inference to the best explanation and then point to yours and go, I win. That's not how that works. Right? Because then I could just say, oh, well, inference to the best explanation. If it's a universal program, that must have meant it was universally supported before it was put into place. So of course they're not attacked. Now I'm using your inference to the best explanation and now I win. Like you can't just say inference to the best explanation and then wave away making any arguments. That's not how that works.
Well, actually, this is an argument and we're considering different explanations. And I'm saying this one seems pretty simple, pretty plausible, pretty explanatory. And you haven't actually given me an alternate one that is particularly plausible at all. In fact, I don't think you've even given me an alternate one that you personally believe. All you've done is throw up, hey, it's possible that X is true. But if I were saying that I have, a valid deductive argument from the data to the claim that this is true, the fact that you could come up with something that it's possible that it was true and there would be an alternate explanation, that would be a good objection. But I'm saying I think this is a pretty simple, pretty elegant, pretty explanatory explanation. And the mere fact that something else that you don't even believe is
so you say
possible,
I don't believe it.
So
you're saying I don't believe
we can't rule it out.
So you're saying I don't believe it, but the honest answer is that like I try to be intellectually honest in my conversations, and I can't sit here and tell you 100% this is why this is. Now you might be comfortable making that assertion, even though you've given me like a number of empirical claims that have just been not true. So I don't even know if you actually know this. You're just more comfortable.
Wait a second. No.
Sure. So the thing that you said about education, that's not true. Our education funding has absolutely increased over the last several decades. Sure. So that's something that's absolutely not true. The idea that rent control hasn't gotten away from something.
And when I said that, I said, hey, this, that was the one I was most tentative about. I said, hey, I'm open to proving wrong about this. I don't think this is the case. But they have that is one. You said a number.
Sure. Okay. 2. Another one is when you were mentioned like, oh, well, like where are these areas that we remove rent control from and it helps? And I gave you an example that we have done that in places like Chicago where we've removed rent control from areas, and empirically it has demonstrated an improvement in that area.
Okay. Hold on. I didn't say find me a place. I'm sorry, but you are trading in ridiculous straw man. I did not say give me a place where rent control has removed and it's helped.
Okay.
This is, I said, give me a place where rent control has been removed and eviction is no longer a major problem. Now, is Chicago one of those places?
Okay. Chicago is one of those places where, and there are a number of them. This is the only one I'm intimately familiar with, but they lifted rent control in a lot of areas, and there were a lot of improvements that happened. Like there was more housing built. The places were renovated.
But the problem is you're shifting over from what we were actually disagreeing about to something that's easier to prove. There was never a disagreement about whether it could help. The disagreement was one about whether it would help as immediately, two, whether it would help as dramatically, and three, most importantly, and this is the big point that you veered away from over and over and over again, would it help as much as rent control plus massive investment in public housing?
I don't know if removing rent control would help as much as rent control plus massive investment in public housing, because I'm guessing the massive investment in public housing is going to erase a lot of the negative aspects of rent control.
Yes, the massive investment in public housing is going to make irrelevant the one and only negative of rent control that you've pointed to.
Well, it won't make it irrelevant. It'll just mask it, because like maybe your housing market is damaged by 5%, but the huge increase in public housing helps by 15%. So now you just get an advantage of 10%. Like that's what I'm saying.
Okay, so they have but if the only concern about rent control, and certainly it's the only one I've heard from you, is that it would lead to less investment in private housing, sure, we can concoct a scenario where we have public housing investment, but it's less than what the private housing investment shortfall is. But they have but that's different from saying that we could have if we combine rent control with enough investment in public housing to make up whatever you think the shortfall is, right? Let's say what you think the shortfall is, and then let's specify that that's how much we invest in public housing, and then it seems like that would neutralize the one and only objection you have in public housing. And just to put a little bow on the point, if you said, okay, well now we're talking about some crazy level of investment in public housing because we've done enough to make up for the shortfall that's caused by rent control. I just point out that it would take an awful, it would be an amazing shortfall such that making it up would still come up with less than the amount of public housing that you have in apparently pretty positive examples like Singapore.
Okay, so all I'm saying is that whatever world you give me, where you're trying to make up the shortfalls of rent control with public housing, you could just not do rent control and you'll always be doing better. If you want, I don't like public housing, but if you want to make massive investments in public housing, it's better than what we have right now, which is massively soaring rents in places that people can't afford. But all I'm saying is if you want to do public housing, then do it, but you don't need rent control to do that. Like prices will fall, people will have places to live. Rent control is always going to be something that hurts you, except for like in very rare, like if you do like soft rent control in really targeted places.
But how is it going to, so the only respect you've given in which it's going to hurt me is that you're going to have less new private housing built. And so what I'm confused about is why you think that it's going to hurt if we combine rent control with at least as much new public housing investment as what you think.
So I think rent control is bad for a number of reasons. Is one, it hurts reinvestment in private housing. Okay, that is one reason. Two is because it damages how people consume housing. It causes a lot of weird, inefficient market reactions that shouldn't happen. And then, so I guess three is that it causes like an underinvestment in other housing, but you would rectify that with public housing, I guess. And then four is that rents in non-rent controlled housing would also increase more, but you would probably counter that by saying every single unit should be rent controlled, I guess.
Yeah, of course every unit should be rent controlled. That's what we're talking about, universal control. The whole discussion started with the Bernie Sanders universal rent control plus massive investment in public housing package of proposals. It's also just not true that you're going to get the same benefits from just massive investment in public housing you're going to get from massive investment in public housing plus rent control, because that is not going to help people as much stay in the places where they are right now. Now, so maybe overall it's going to help, more of them or more people stay in more of the places, over the course of a few years or something as effects kick in. But if you are facing in the near term eviction because your rent keeps going up, then just massive investment in public housing is going to help you as much as massive investment in public housing plus rent control.
Okay,
Why would you want different groups of people?
Why would you want new units that are being built for those new units to be rent controlled?
Well, first of all, a lot of the
Your mic cut off. A lot of the what?
A lot of the disadvantages of rent control are because of the non-universality. So if it's it's going to structurally mirror the reason why we want wage instead of a patchwork of minimum wages in different places, that they have that you're not going to get the same investment that you are, for example, the same incentive that you are, for example, to sell a rent controlled building to a new owner, to then demolish the place and then rebuild a new building location where they can just charge whatever they want for rent. If you have if everything is happening within a scheme for universal rent control.
So earlier you talked about how you like universal programs because they're more pragmatic in terms of like surviving than non-universal ones.
Yes.
Why do you think there's any possibility ever that we could literally like decommodify all housing in the United States then?
All right. So is the question, why do I just support this, rather than supporting going further?
Well, because what you're talking about right now is essentially the decommodification of housing in the United States.
Well, no, it's not.
It is.
Well, no.
I can connect it if you want. I mean, like it's a pretty clear line. If you're going to rent control every property, and then you're going to start building public housing that's publicly funded, that's also rent controlled, you're not going to let private people build. Even if they could build, they're never going to be able to compete with taxpayer funded properties, and everything is going to be forced to be rent controlled anyway. There's not going to be any private investment in rent controlled areas, and then it's all going to be public housing basically. That's the line you're going to.
Okay. So two things about that. First of all, actually, it's kind of interesting because it sounds a lot like Republican arguments about why the ACA to the end of private health insurance, because you had all these restrictions on private health insurance. But
okay, wait.
Also,
so firstly, hold on. You can't just make appeals to saying this sounds like a Republican argument, and like you're just using that as a way to like poison the well or whatever. Secondly, secondly, I just have to respond real quickly.
It's not poisoning the well. It's calling attention to the fact that I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, you weren't swayed by that argument, which might make us, by analogy, take another look at this to see what the difference is.
You would have to see if the two industries are analogous. So I don't believe that the free market can successfully deliver healthcare. It just doesn't seem to work. Private healthcare systems don't seem to work for a number of reasons because consumers aren't able to negotiate for health prices for a number of reasons. If you have a heart attack, you're not going to go price shopping for the best hospital. And there's a lot of reasons why healthcare doesn't work in the private market. Housing seems to be something that can probably be taken care of by the private market. You've got plenty of time to make a decision about it. There's a lot of different choices available to you. There's a lot of competing people that are building houses. Like it seems to be something that like markets can negotiate a lot better. So just because I would use some arguments against rent control or decommodifying all houses doesn't mean I would make the same arguments against decommodifying, say, healthcare.
Well, actually, that wasn't the analogy. The analogy wasn't between decommodifying healthcare and decommodifying housing. The analogy was between your argument that the combination of rent control and massive investment in public housing would lead to the end of private housing, which is different from decommodification. Let's get to that in a second. That was like the standard Republican argument when Obamacare was first being trotted out, when it had a public option attached to it, that the combination of all of these restrictions on what private health insurers could do to make money, plus this public option, was going to lead to the end of private health insurance, which maybe I'm wrong. I'm assuming you didn't buy that one, did you?
No, I agree with it. It could. It probably will. But I'm okay with that. Like if we do a multi-payer system and all private insurance ends up drying up, then fuck it. Fuck private insurance. If the public market...
Okay. That's interesting. I'm less optimistic, I'm enthusiastic about thought it worked out that way. But in the case of housing, so decommodifying housing would mean abolishing rent, right? That would be the equivalent. Just have it being paid for through tax money. The way that when we talk about decommodifying healthcare, we're talking about abolishing premiums and generally speaking, also abolishing copays and deductibles. and just having it all being paid for it out of tax money. Even if we completely eliminated the existence of private landlords, that still wouldn't add up to the decommodification of housing. We can talk about whether decommodification is a good idea. Right?
So in rent-controlled areas in your world where you have public housing and people can't afford the rent in a rent-controlled building, you would kick them out? You would evict them?
Well, I think you can. I don't think you have to go. I think that you can have actually already exist for certain kinds of public housing, and certainly
wait. So if you have somebody that lives in a house right now that gets rent controlled and they still can't afford their rent, you would have the state come in and evict that person.
I think that rather than have so first of all, if you're gonna keep pushing this, second, let's do the explanation. They have what would actually in the case of public housing, right? Not just rent controlled private housing, but public housing. We could do what actually exists in many places. Certainly, both in the global examples, Singapore, Vienna, etc., and also what already exists in many places in the United States, which is that you could have that the public units wouldn't necessarily be rent free, but there'd be a sliding scale. It might be rent free while you're unemployed. They have the rent could be indexed to your income. I mean, none of this is hypothetical. All of this actually does exist in lots of places. And if the question is, sure, if you had that system, would there be circumstances under which eviction would happen? Of course, in the same way that even if something is being sold by the government, right?
So you're telling me that for these units you would means test them?
Not means so. I would means test them in the sense that Social Security is means tested in the sense that Medicaid is means tested. So we could have means testing in the sense that that what rent you're charged varies.
Wait, how is Social Security means tested?
Social Security is means tested because
Wait, because what? Your mic is cutting out.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. How's this?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Social Security is means tested in the sense that how much you earn is in part.
What did he say? Or is it just cutting out for me, or?
No, it's cutting out for me too.
Oh, interesting. It's stationary. I don't know what's going on.
Okay.
So Social Security. Let me just try this last point real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Social Security is means tested in the sense that what you earn is in part a function of what your income was.
Okay.
So in other words, there's means testing in the sense that something is in Social Security, you're actually earning more because you were, during your working life.
Because you were paying more. Yeah, I feel like I've never heard means testing described that way before. That usually means tested is just this is what you get based on what you make, whereas Social Security you actually get paid out based on what you paid in. I don't know if I would consider that means testing, but I'm being really pedantic right now, so that's okay.
Okay. I was had conversation last week with Noah Smith from Bloomberg. He was describing it that way. Okay. But whatever. If we don't want to call that means tested,
this is super pedantic of me. Don't worry, keep going.
This is but in the sense, I think the more important distinction we want to make is means testing in the sense that what you pay is dependent on your means, and means testing in the sense that whether you qualify at all has some sort of cutoff based on your means. And I think it would be very important not to means test public housing in the second sense, because I actually think that a lot of the historic disadvantages of public housing in the U.S. have been a function of the fact that public housing complexes were economically segregated, just a place where very poor people lived. Whereas I think if you had a mixture of income levels, which is something that you do, as I understand it, have in these examples like Singapore, Vienna, etc., then I think that they're not going to be centers of crime in the same way, etc., etc. So yeah, I'd means test in the sense that rent would be charged at different levels depending on income. I would not means test in the sense that some people just couldn't live there at all.
Wait, so do you agree with means testing then for education or healthcare, or would that be universal?
I think those things should be completely decommodified.
So why would you make education and healthcare completely decommodified, completely universal, but you would means test for housing?
So again, I think calling it means testing is pretty misleading. But they have but just basically what I would say.
Wait, why is it misleading? A sliding scale of how much you pay based on how much you earn sounds literally like the textbook definition of means testing to me.
Okay, well, usually means testing is certain people just aren't eligible.
Well, I imagine so. In your case, I imagine that certain people probably wouldn't get much of a cut in their rent at all if they were like millionaires or something, or if they made like $700,000 a year. You probably wouldn't give them a big discount on their public housing, right?
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to look into. It's not my system. What I'm describing is my understanding of how mixed income level public housing systems around.
Sure. So like the earned income tax credit is means tested, but it's a sliding scale as well. It's not like you get it and then you make $1 more and it's chopped off. Like it's means tested. It's a scaling thing that tapers off. But
okay, well, regardless, I'm certainly open to if Lance tells me tomorrow, hey Ben, I read this awesome thing about how totally work, then obviously my ideological inclinations are such that I would love that, right? I'd be all over that, and I'd be very eager to read into that and to see if it sounded plausible to me.
I just don't understand why we were so adamant earlier about how important like a universal system was to everything, so that it couldn't be taken away. But for housing, we could make this all means tested.
First of all, it is universal in the sense that that Social Security is universal, and Social Security actually does strike me as a pretty convincing test case for the claim that universality is an advantage for political durability.
I don't know if I would agree that Social Security is universal. Like that's something that you can only collect on after a certain age. I don't think that's universal in the same way that like healthcare is universal or housing can be universal or whatever.
Okay, but the fact that that everybody knows that they will someday collect it, or in fact,
well, if you pay into it,
in order to try to, well, I mean, my understanding is that even if you're that you do eventually start collecting some Social Security, but the fact that it's widely perceived as being something that everybody is eventually going to get, I think does make it more politically durable. I think in fact that's the reason why there have had to, in order to try to drum up public opposition to it, there have to be all these lies about how it's going broke, by the time you get to that age you're not going to collect it, etc., because that's like one of the only ways to try to undermine support for it. But to go back to the original question about what's the difference, right? What's the difference between healthcare and education and public housing? I would just say that the difference isn't necessarily going to even be, look, if you had a good, viable way of making totally decommodified housing work, which I think I just said I'd be very open to. But if you came up with such a good way, then yeah, I think that if we were talking about what not to try to push for it, it would absolutely be a consideration in its favor that things that are workable, totally decommodified, totally seem to be more politically durable than things that aren't universal, or that people or that aren't decommodified in that way. That would totally be a point in its favor, but that doesn't mean that overall we should go for that. Right now, I'd be concerned that as far as I know, like I said, I'd actually love to be corrected about this, but as far as I know, there aren't yet any good test cases for totally decommodified, so totally universally, totally rent-free housing systems. So if there were, I'd say, yeah, let's push for that, right? And the fact that the universality would make it easy once we had it would totally be a point in its favor. But as far as I know, and so like I told you when we had the original discussion, about capitalism and socialism as much as possible. I like to instead of advertising my political wild into the unknown as much as at all possible, I'd like to extrapolate from things that have been shown to be workable in real life, and at the very least start with.
Okay, so working back, because we keep circling back to these things that are universal are less attackable or whatever. And the only defense we had of this was our best inference. If I say that universal programs are more easily defended because in order for them to be implemented, they have to have universal approval, how is your inference any better than mine?
Okay. Well, I think that we know I think one difference between those two is that we know going into does in fact benefit, right? Of
Wait,
course,
hold on. Can you say that again? Your mic cut out.
Yeah. God damn it. I don't know why that's happening. So we know going into this that everybody, in fact, can use NHS hospital, right? So, and we know that that's a pretty widely known fact.
Okay.
That everybody could do that, and there's a pretty simple, pretty elegant explanation linking that to the high popularity of it. Now, if the claim was that that the programs were only place because they had universal approval, then that's based on an empirical premise that, at the very least, I don't think we know, and I will at least say that I'd be very surprised if in any of these cases, right, it wasn't that these things weren't actually pretty controversial.
So people keep pointing out
when first being implemented. So, for example, right.
We don't need an example. So people keep pointing out like Social Security and Medicare. These aren't universal programs, right? Medicare only applies to old people. Social Security is only withdrawable in retirement. So people keep pointing to like the fact that these are wildly popular. I can very easily point out the reason why they're popular is because old people draw on them and old people vote. Like, boom. And I can actually empirically point that out, that if you look at the participation elections, so those two programs I can give a much more concise explanation without having to draw on any kind of weird ethereal out there explanations and saying, well, it's you, blah, blah, blah. I can just like, old people vote. These are programs for old people. It makes more sense that these programs might be more popular to these people. Firstly,
I think that people are generally aware that they
are people are generally aware that what?
Ben, one thing I might suggest is, do you have any browsers open? Close any browsers you might. It could be like your internet is being shared or something like that.
Wait, you think that
it's happening on both ends? So
you think that people might be aware of what?
The universal existence of aging. That people are aware that they will one day become old.
So you appeal to that as a joke. I don't know if you're American or not, but when I was growing up and in my 20s, there was a very real concern that Social Security wouldn't be available for people like me anymore. I actually completely disagree with that. I think that people are constantly worried about Social Security being in existence for people like me when I hit retirement.
If you remember, this is actually something I brought up earlier, that that it's not a very real concern. It was always nonsense. They have but remember what I said earlier, that this obviously is a political benefit, that people know that they'll one day get it, which is why there had to be all this disinformation spread about how, it's going broke. By the time you're old enough, you won't be able to draw from it. That the reason why the right wing had to use that strategy was because without that, that would give people such an obvious reason to support it, that they knew that they would one day become eligible for.
Okay. But I don't think that these are like, I don't agree that these are universal right now in the same way that like healthcare would be universal. Like there is no guarantee that you draw from, like they're not, like they're just functionally, these aren't the same thing. Firstly. Secondly, I don't think that we've established why your inference that, in order for you to establish this with some kind of data point, you would have to show me here's a program that had like 52% support, but after it was implemented, now it has like 85% support. That this program was barely popular, but once it's implemented and it's universal, now it's wildly popular. Because what I'm more curious is if you have a program that had 80% support and then was implemented and continues to have 80% support. Because in that case, then a program being universal doesn't mean that it's harder to take away. The fact that it's universal just because it was already popular, so it was never going to be taken away. It had nothing to do about the universality of it. It just had to do with the fact that it was already immensely popular. Because I don't think your inference is any better than mine. I think both stories are. I would argue that mine has more explanatory power than yours because of how policy works. But I mean,
well, hold on. I mean, they have in my case, we're not relying on anything true. What we're relying on and extrapolating from is the fact that these programs, yes, obviously, programs that only kick in at a certain age are not universal among age groups. They're universal in the sense that they're universal among people, but they have but all I'm relying on is people knowing and seeing that they will benefit from it being universal, and this being something that it makes sense to think would be a political advantage. What you're relying on is this totally hypothetical claim that these things were wildly popular when they were implemented. So as a matter of fact, right, we're both Americans, but we have a Canadian presence. Lance, when the NDP, or what became the NDP, first started talking about instituting universal health insurance, how did the Conservatives feel about it?
They weren't stoked.
Kind of what I figured. Now, do Canadian Conservatives currently say let's abolish?
No, it's a non-starter.
Because it's so popular.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be political suicide to do
okay, support for Canadian universal insurance. So, like, you're telling, so if I were to go, so what you're saying, and this could be true, because I looked for this data, I couldn't find it, but it could be true, but you're telling me that if I were to go and I were to look up, like, Canadian support for Canadian universal insurance, that the Conservatives would have not supported it. It would have been very low percentages, but now it's supported in very high percentages.
As in they fought it when it was first being implemented by what became the NDP?
Yeah, so I'll look for those numbers later, since it sounds like we don't have
it. But yes, they push back against it. Back historically, yes, of course.
Sure.
Whereas now, if you look up their current election, they never say, because they know that would be a political non-starter.
Mm-hmm. It's the same reason our Conservative Party doesn't talk about abortion, even though it's probably within a lot of the caucus something that interests them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, I'll look it up, but I mean, I know examples of this, like, flipping around on the other end too. The most one I'm intimately familiar with is the universal education that the United Kingdom provided, and it did provide it to all citizens, and everybody did seem to support it, but then eventually it became too much of a problem because it didn't work out, and then it lost support.
All right, so I would be very interested in the detail. It didn't work out. Whether, I'm sure there are things you could point to about overuse, etc., but whether this was actually like a huge strain on the budget, or whether this is more of a reflection of just shifting ideological winds that conservative and new Labor government.
Wait, why is it that when you talk about the Canadian thing now, when you talk about the Canadian thing, you use your inference to say it's universal, that's why it's supported, end of discussion, my inference is good. But now when I point to accounting, I was like, well, it's more nuanced, maybe the ideological driftings over time. Why couldn't I say that about your Canadian example? Well, maybe ideologically Canada drifted further to the left.
Because, my claim is just that it's a political advantage to be universal. That's it. End of claim. As far as the UK, that despite having this political advantage, this was overturned. And although I'd be interested in, for example, whether Corbyn's Labour Party currently wants to bring it back and how that's polling, etc. But sure, despite this advantage, it was overturned. But what I was starting to point out earlier in the discussion was, I believe, my understanding is, right, maybe there are British people in the chat, they can correct me about this if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is that education is much more tracked in the UK.
What do you mean by tracked? When you say tracked, what do you mean by that?
Tracked meaning like whether or not you can go to university, or like at best you can go to some like 2-year trade school or something, is decided much earlier on in the education system, depending on like test outcomes earlier in the process, etc., than it is in the U.S. Right? Like in the U.S., in theory, you can be a total fuck up in high school, but you can there are community college grades, transfer to 4-year school, and then like go to grad school or law school or whatever. My understanding, again, I could be wrong about this, but what I think might be the case about the UK is that what your options are might be decided. When people talk about all those test results, the A levels and the O levels stuff, that might be decided earlier on, which would be relevant to this discussion because it speaks to how much of a constituent there is, right? Is this something that people think is going to benefit everybody, or is this something that for example, a lot of working class people, might think isn't really going to benefit them, isn't really relevant to them, and so they might not get excited about it the same way they get excited if somebody said, let's abolish the NHS and go back to a system where hospitals were mostly private.
Okay, I will look into this. I have to leave because I'm already like way overstayed. Listen, thank you for being real mean. I'm glad you weren't nice and then mean later, so I appreciate it, Ben. I love my conversation with you. We will revisit this in the future, and I will.
Last time you were real nice in the moment.
Well, because you gave me like the same lefty answers to global socialist revolution to make socialism. I was like,
yeah, okay, except that's totally not what I said. What I said was you were making all kinds of arguments against the viability of socialism that seemed to include as a premise that we be imagining the United States as the only island of socialism in the socialist world. I said that seems like an extraordinarily unrealistic premise given comparative ideological facts about the United States and other countries in the world. And you seem to have decided after the fact, because you were very concessive in the debate, right? During the debate, you conceded all kinds of things. You said that
I don't think I conceded a single thing.
Oh no, you totally did. Listen to about halfway through when you were saying, oh, I guess if we did already have all these social democratic things, it might be reasonable to start pushing, for more of the economy.
That I've never conceded that. That's always been my point. So, for instance, I like the idea of single-payer healthcare, but I would never push for it initially. I don't hate the idea of a socialist economy, but I would never push for it initially. If we gradually or incrementally work our way towards things, that's always been my position. I'm not the one on Twitter every day tweeting with all my other friends about how we need the revolution right now. That's always been my position, is incremental change.
Neither am I. Tell me one time in my fucking life I've tweeted we need.
Oh, well, I don't know. Well, in that case, then we don't disagree on much, so I don't know why you would disagree with me about anything. The problem I have with socialists is that when they try to tell me they can fix hard problems like climate change with socialism, and I ask them how, they end up hand-waving all the hard problems. So, like, for instance, like, we've had a big thing. I don't want to get... Okay.
There's no hand-waving. There were several ways that would just be better. It was never claimed that it would be 100%, or we wouldn't still need a strong state to regulate it. But there were, I think, several plausible claims that were made about ways in which the incentives of cooperatives would be better than the environmental incentives of traditional hierarchical firms.
Sure, all of these I disagreed with, and I don't feel like they were adequately rebutted.
Okay. Well, in any case,
I love you. We'll talk later, okay? Definitely.
Yeah. I love you too. I hope that you do a better job of accurately representing this debate than you.
Okay, I'll try it. Oh my god, dude, this is so hard. I don't know if I'm getting older and dumber. Dude, I can't follow anything he says. I'm actually like staring into my screen, trying so fucking hard. He talks so much, and I feel like he says so little. It's so fucking hard. I can't. Holy shit. I don't know if I don't know if it's just like me, like I just can't keep up with it anymore or what. But like, Jesus, I felt like every answer, like when he would asking me over and over again, like, what is your answer to this? And I'm like, what is your answer to what? And he's like, well, if we decommodify housing and then we do means tested, and we've seen in places of the world where universal programs have more support, and then we make massive public housing available on a sliding scale, Destiny, then what? I'm like, oh god, I don't know. I don't know what you're asking me. And then I try to ask the Serfs, like, can you tell me what he's asking? He's like, well, I don't think it's fair for me to speak for Ben. Oh my god, I can't. Holy shit. Okay, Jesus Christ. Okay, I have to go. I was supposed to go like fucking 20,000 hours ago. Fuck, I think I muted my donations. Listen, I love you all very much. Toastmaster, hey dude, what's up? Thanks for subbing, buddy.
Shut the fuck up. What you've done here is you've made me tired, okay? That's what you fucking did.
Yeah?
That's all you did.
Okay.
Like,